Hi everyone, Miss Curdy here, and today we're going to be talking about topic 12-6. And before we get started, we're just going to talk about how to measure. So you'll need to grab this sheet. As always, we are going to fold it in half, and then you will be cutting it in half later and gluing it in your notebook. And aside from that, you're also going to need a ruler, and we have two options. We have this longer one that's a whole foot, and then we have a smaller ruler that goes up to 6 inches. Now on this ruler, you're going to notice that one side has inches, and then when you flip it around, you have centimeters on the other side. So for this, we're going to be measuring everything in inches, so please be careful that you're using the correct side. This ruler has up to 12 inches, and then if you flip it over, the centimeters are on the other side. So when we look at this, we want to make sure that whenever we're measuring, we start at 0. So here we've got the 1 inch marked here. We don't see the 0, but we know that the 0 is going to be at the very end. So when we're measuring things, for example, if I were going to measure this marker, we want to line things up at the very edge. And they've gone and color coded it, so we see that 1 inch is here in white, and there's another inch in red, white, red, and so on and so forth. And then down here, the same, we'd want to start at the very edge here, and this only goes up to 6 inches. So either ruler that you want is fine with me. Alright, so let's take a look at the note sheet. So some things to keep in mind. Number one, rulers are just like number lines, and they can be partitioned into halves, fourths, eighths. We can even go all the way to sixteenths. The smaller the unit, like the sixteenths here, the more accurate your measurements are going to be. So we're going to be looking at rulers that are partitioned into fourths. Now, when we look at our rulers, only our whole numbers are going to be labeled, and we see that here as well. Just the whole numbers on our rulers are labeled. But if we were to fill in our rulers, we would see more than just our whole numbers. And what we would do is go ahead, and I want us to fill these in together. So now, looking at a ruler, I see that from 0 to 1 is our full. Now, if this were just like a number line, I know that in the middle, I would have 1/2. Right before that is going to be 1/4 and 3/4. And this pattern is going to repeat for every inch. We have 0, 1/4, 1/2, 3/4, a whole. Then we're going to have 1 and 1/4, 1 and 1/2, 1 and 3/4. Let me zoom in a little bit. 2 wholes, and then 2 and 1/4, 2 and 1/2, 2 and 3/4, 3. 3 and 1/4, 3 and 1/2, 3 and 3/4, 4. And this would continue as long as however long your ruler is. Notice how some of the fourths and halves are going to overlap with a whole at the same point. And here's what I mean by that. Here we have 1/4 and 1/2. This can be also called 2/4. This one whole is 2 halves, but it's also 4/4. And we talked about equivalent fractions. And these are going to repeat throughout the entire thing. So every half can also be labeled as 1 and 2/4, and every whole can be labeled as halves, 4 halves, and then also fourths, which would be 8/4, because those are equivalent fractions. So now, whenever we're measuring to the nearest 1/4 of an inch, we can look at all of our tick marks. Any of these tick marks can be measuring to the nearest 1/4, because I have 1/4, 2/4, 3/4, 4/4, 5/4, 6/4, 7/4, 8/4, and so on and so forth. When we're measuring to the nearest half, we only look at the halves and the wholes, because our halves can be 2/4, 1/2 here, or 2 halves, 3 halves, 4 halves, 5 halves, 6 halves, and so on and so forth. That's going to sound a little bit confusing now, but the more we work through it, the more it will make sense. Let's move on to part 2. So we want to look at the glue stick below and measure it to the nearest 1/2. Notice that it's more than 2 whole inches. When I look at this, I see I've got 1 whole inch here, a 2nd whole inch here, and then a little extra here. It's not quite 3 though. So I know my measurement is going to be 2 holes and then a fraction. So I'm looking at this, and since I'm measuring to the nearest half, I'm only looking at my halves and my wholes. I'm ignoring my fourths, smaller tick marks. So I see that we've got 2 and then 1/2. So it's 2.5 inches long. Notice how I write my whole number large, and my fraction is about the same height as my total whole number here, 2 and then 1/2. So now let's look at the nail below. Now we want to measure this to the nearest 1/4 of an inch. So when I'm looking at this, the tick marks I can be looking at are the halves, the fourths, and the wholes. It works for any of these because all of these little jumps can be considered fourth pieces, because between each hole I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. So here I see that I've got 1 whole inch, 2 whole inch, 3 whole inches, and then here I'm at this first tick mark, and I know that this is going to be 3 and 1/4. Oh, not 1/2, 1/4. 3 and 1/4 inches. All right, so that is practicing how to measure. If you are not feeling comfortable with this, it's okay. You can sign up for a mini lesson, or you can practice a couple on your own and see how it goes. The biggest thing to keep in mind is that when we're measuring to the nearest half and half, we're looking at the halves and the wholes, and when we're measuring to the nearest fourth, we're looking at the fourths, halves, and wholes. I'm just going to show you one more thing on the back of this paper. You do not need to write this down, but I just want to show you one more time how our fractions line up. So if I have a number line that shows 0, 1, 2, 3 are whole numbers, and now I'm going to show you right below that a number line that's been broken up into halves. So I have 1/2, 2 halves, 3 halves, 4 halves, 5 halves, 6 halves. Notice that one whole, each whole lines up with fractions as well. And if I show you the same number line with 1 whole, 2 wholes, and 3 wholes, and I break that up into fourths now, when I label it 1/4, 2/4, 3/4, 4/4, you're going to notice that halves line up, our wholes are going to line up, and so on and so forth. So once again, when you're measuring to the nearest 1/4 of an inch or 1/4 inch, you're going to be looking at every single tick mark. For the halves, you're just looking at halves and wholes. And then if I ever want to the nearest full inch, you're only looking at our whole inches. All right, so give this lesson a try, and then sign up for a mini lesson if you would need some additional help. And don't forget, you're going to need to grab a ruler. That's all for today, and I will see you back here for the next 12-6 video.